So let's start with this point here. If the article, guys, that came out of the EU, it stated the EU to send, pay attention to this, and I put in quote here because it's not my word, it's theirs. EU to send civilian military mission in West Africa. What's wrong with that title, guys? What do you think?
Right.
Can you just put the answer there? But here is where the knowledge for Elizabeth comes in. Because if you read that sentence carefully, the EU to send civilian military mission in West Africa. Can you unpack this for us?
All right. So we're looking at civilian military, right? So if they just said military, we're sending a military operation into Africa. That means a very different thing than civilian military. One of the big things that's been happening is the civilian population has been uprising all over Africa over the last decade or so. And so what we just saw in Niger was the people was a civilian uprising. And so we're looking at not the heavy-handed language of we have a military operation and we're going to do this. We're going to obliterate you guys. It's a civilian military operation
to soften
the blow, and also to say we have the support of the population to do this, right?
Which they don't.
But if they say they have the civilian military operation, that means they're using their own people to go do this also, and that they have that support from the civilian population. Interesting, right?
Well, but also what's very even more interesting is the idea of that the European Union that plans to do this. They only said it will include police, it will include military personnel. And guess where this came from? From a German source. Yeah. And the idea that this is what I found, without specifying. So how can you embark on an intervention, on a mission, on a venture, whatever term you want to use, without providing the detail? That's like what we do here. Can we just sit here and talk about whatever? If we don't give our viewers, here is what we're going to be talking about in this episode.
Right. And it's interesting exactly what you just brought up, David. So it came out of a German newspaper, Die Welt am Sonntag. I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly, but very often it's interesting. We get these little tidbits. I actually remember another thing that we got from a German newspaper that was geopolitically related. I think it was about a year ago, but it's interesting how these little things kind of get leaked, right? They get leaked into, because nowhere else is reporting it. Everywhere that's talking about it is talking about this newspaper article for it.
Well, because there is also an objective into leaking information. Sometimes, we used to see it in Washington. I was there.
The US dollar has lost 85% of its value since the 70s, when the dollar decoupled from gold. And the government seems bent on continuing the tradition. From now until after the next elections, the government can print as much money as they want. The last time they did that, inflation went up 9%. This means one thing: the security of your future and your family's future is all in your hands. Make sure you freeze the value of the wealth you're holding. Invest with Noble Gold Investments. Gold is the one asset that has proven to withstand recession, inflation, and just about all economic threats. Noble Gold Investments is here to help you if you want to invest in gold. You'll also get a 24-karat, 1/4 ounce gold standard coin for free. Go to geopoliticsgold.com now. That's geopoliticsgold.com. Or simply call 1-877-646-5347. The only gold company I trust. And remember, there's always a risk with investments, and there are no guarantees of any kind.
We will, by design, you leak tidbits of information.
Yeah.
So there are media outlets there that works in conjunction with certain entities inside the government. They'll take the story and run with it. But the objective wasn't about. The objective is to just leak that information. So now you have people span up as to what does it mean?
Well, and interestingly enough, so
Yeah.
if we look at what they said, so this is what they said was the reason in this newspaper article. So the reason behind their planned mission, right, was so we can't say the names of these groups because
No.
YouTube doesn't like it and will demonetize us and all of that. So we'll let your imagination go as to what the names of these groups are. They're ones that you would recognize from the news a lot. That this extremist group could extend their activities in West Africa from the Sahel zone, where have we heard that region recently, towards the southern coastal countries on the Gulf of Guinea, leading to even more widespread instability in the region. And so that's from Welt am Sonntag. Now, where have we heard about this zone recently? From what's been going on with Niger, right?
Niger, that's correct. Yeah, I was thinking because when you mentioned that,
Mhm.
it brought to my mind some ideas about this leak thing. Why?
Yeah.
Just to go back to that one, to highlight to you guys, there's a story going on right now
Mhm.
that you wonder why people don't hear much about. And this has to do with the deal that China refused now. They canceled
Yeah.
some orders from Germany.
Mhm.
So, and one time I had somebody said to me, I live in Germany and I couldn't find this information.
Yeah.
It doesn't take a genius to figure out
It does not.
Why? Because it was a major
Mhm.
deal that let me share with you guys the link here so you can take a look at it yourself. And
Oh, in the chat.
I'm gonna post it for them.
Okay.
It's because I did the video on it on the other channel.
Perfect.
So once you'll and I put about 11 links to it. It's
Mhm.
all matter of where you find the information. This is
Exactly.
what people do not. I
Yeah.
want you guys to know, because we care about how you consume the knowledge. We want you
Mhm.
to really learn and know how to read between the lines.
Right.
This is why I've been targeted from an academia per se, because I know how to read between the lines. And when you challenge somebody who is he or she or they or the
Yeah.
entity, whatever, putting information out there
Yep.
to really manipulate.
Right.
That's like
To
what you
redirect. Yeah.
exactly. That's the whole point
Yeah.
of it. So
Well, and guys, pay attention to that. The people, I found it interesting over my lifetime watching who gets targeted and who doesn't.
yeah,
And who gets targeted by who and who doesn't. So some of the people that are, like we have cancel culture. Cancel
yeah.
culture is horrible right now.
Yeah.
And if somebody is about to be canceled and you look at the reason and you're like, is this for real?
Real. Yeah.
Look at what that person is saying,
Same.
because they're likely saying something that the powers that be don't
Yeah.
want you to hear or don't want you to listen to.
Well, this is most likely what we're going to be talking about tomorrow in
On Rumble. Yeah.
Because we're going to be exposing some stuff. So let's go back to our topic here quickly here, because I need to highlight one thing. Now, what the EU is saying, let me put the map for you guys, and I'm going to leave it there for a few seconds while I elaborate on certain aspects of it. And the reason why I wanted to let that on for you to see, this is what I'm pointing out. This is the whole region. And what the EU is saying right now is saying that they fear extremist groups,
right, in this region that happens to include Niger.
Yeah. And this is where, but my point also is not about that. My point is also about how now the West is reverting back to extremism.
Right.
So,
right.
What is the truth about all this?
Yeah.
Which they are not discussed. As a matter of fact, I read the analysis of a professor of international relations at the University of Geneva. His name is Hosni Abedi. He was spot on certain aspects. I still have to, I will use the term disagree respectfully, of course, but he was spot on certain aspects of it from his analysis perspective. Where I disagree with him on is that he either forgot or whatever. I'm not pointing fingers here, just to highlight that the presence of NATO has not been mentioned into all this. So you take the EU and you take the NATO's mission and planning. So why the EU is saying, oh, because we want to prevent extremism, but not saying, oh, because NATO is expanding. Well, if you look at the map, You look at the map here, guys.
Mhm.
NATO is already conducting training in this part of the world, in this part of the Sahel. This one here, I don't know if they
No,
don't see the
they don't see
cursor.
the they don't see
Sorry,
the
I
cursor.
thought you guys
It's
see the
okay.
cursor where I'm pointing out. In Mauritania,
Okay.
Mauritania is all the way on near the
Yeah.
Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
That's where now they're expanding
Mhm.
security collaboration under the umbrella of fighting extremism.
Right.
Now you take what's going on in Niger,
Right.
and you can just see how they're overlapping.
Right.
So for any average person, this is so complicated. You
It's
have
so
to break
complicated.
it down.
Yeah.
And this is where I see the arguments of the EU. I mean, I respected the Professor Abidi from
Yeah.
the University of Geneva. He was spot on as
Yeah.
to what the European Union is. But the European Union also refrained
Mhm.
by design intentionally
Yeah.
from mentioning that because of NATO's presence.
Absolutely. Well, because I think if people knew that that's what was happening,
Yeah.
because right now we're seeing the expansion of NATO, right? We're
Yeah.
seeing it into Southeast Asia. We're
Mhm.
seeing the expansion of NATO through we watched the expansion of NATO over the last few decades 3 times in Europe
That's
when
correct.
they said absolutely that would not happen. And now we're seeing it expand sort of all over the world. And the question is why?
That is correct.
That's not the purpose that it was
Yeah.
meant for.
And
So why?
You're right. That's a legitimate question to ask. And you know how I always say,
Mm-hmm.
nothing happens in a vacuum
Absolutely.
in geopolitics,
Yeah.
right? All this, what we're talking about, happens against the backdrop
Mm-hmm.
of the current
Right.
U.S. official. His name is Molly Fay. He's the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State
Mhm.
for African Affairs, who is right now in Western African nations.
Mhm.
So EU statements didn't happen just out of thin air.
Right.
It was the coordination there.
Right.
That tells you right there. Because the concern about losing
Right.
access to, they don't care for democracy. They are concerned about losing access to
Resources.
Exactly.
And so we're talking about resources, right? So one of the things that was mentioned at the beginning of the coup situation that hasn't really been talked about much since is the pipeline. So one of the things
Yes.
that's happening here is that all of this oil that was or natural gas oil that was supposed to be going
Mhm.
to Europe,
Europe.
the EU right now, is being cut off. So we had the Nord Stream pipeline incident, whatever you sabotage,
Yeah.
it's very clearly sabotage,
Of
right?
course.
So we had that sabotaged. There was a plan to send it from the United States. That also got nixed. And now we have this pipeline that was supposed to go through Niger, Nigeria, and Libya.
Algeria.
Algeria.
It's supposed to go through Algeria.
And now that's nixed too because of what's going on in Niger. So what's happening is that EU is being cut off. From gas.
It's their own failed policies.
Absolutely.
They followed blindly, not knowing what they're getting themselves into.
And
straightforward.
This particularly to me is interesting because there's a situation overall in Africa where they seem to be pushing back on colonialism and on the colonialist countries. And the colonialist countries, they're talking about tides of instability and they don't want instability. And, they were a little bit later, we'll talk about the claims from France that they're doing this enormous amount of good to Africa. The issue with that is that out of one side of their mouth, they're talking about all the good that they're doing for the African people and in the various countries that they're very heavily in. And on the other side, poverty in Africa, to me, I've grown up with poverty in Africa. There's never been a time where, for any reason, I thought these African nations that we were talking about were doing well. So for all of the decades that those countries have been in those countries in Africa, they're not doing well still. So I don't understand the claims that are being made that all of these African countries are, especially West African countries, are doing so well because of the colonialist countries. It seems like it's out of both sides of their mouth. Because growing up, what we heard was there's starving kids in Africa. So you have to finish what's on your plate because there's starving kids in Africa. There's no point where I sat there and said, oh, well, the African nations are doing well. And you bring this up all the time, David, that the biggest resource is gold, right? Which country is it that is the biggest resource is gold?
Uganda.
Uganda. And
They
that
got a
most
lot.
of it is sent to France.
Yeah, I think there's some also, I believe, in Niger
Yeah,
itself,
I think it's
Mali
in Niger too.
or
Yeah.
Burkina Faso, one of them. But
Yeah.
Africa has a lot of resources onto that. So the whole idea of all this is the EU
Yeah.
now losing. They realize that that's it. Africa now is pushing back
Right.
and almost saying we've had it. We had
Right.
enough. I mean, it used to be, and it's not, it used to be still. Her name is Dr. Arikana Chihombori. Let me share an
Okay.
image with you guys. And as a matter of fact, I'm gonna reach out to her to invite her.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
She lives here in the U.S.
Yeah.
in Tennessee. Let me share with you guys an image of her, and she's been saying this all along, but yet the European, the Western world ignored her
Yeah.
calls for this. This is her image right
Oh,
now. Yeah.
yeah.
So the very, 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 very savvy lady.
Mhm.
She even served on a capacity of ambassador. So I intend to reach out to her and we'll
Oh, that
invite
would
her
be
for this
wonderful.
episode.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
I would actually love her perspective on this situation, because it is, it's interesting that we're starting to get this narrative right now
Yeah.
that the groups, I'm just going to call them groups,
Yeah.
that the United States is concerned about. We've known that the United States had a drone base in Niger. That was one of the first things that came out when the story broke, right? We've known that. And that's not something that I think they're willing to give up. And this base is
Yeah.
for group activities,
That's
type of
correct.
group that we can't
That's
really talk
that's
about.
correct. Yeah.
Group activities. And so right now we're watching it's interesting that they're very concerned about this region specifically
Yeah.
and instability.
Yeah.
When Victoria Nuland went and couldn't see the former president
Bazoum.
Bazoum.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
She couldn't see him.
Yeah. Well,
and-
because she couldn't dictate the terms. They were like
Right.
to her, like, who the heck are you to come and dictate, visiting,
Yeah.
there's also something in a diplomatic protocol.
Yeah.
You don't break protocol. But when you start dictating to host, as a matter of fact, there are now a conversation from
Yeah.
some observers that, they get into the point of saying, well, wait a minute. Why is the Western world all of a sudden getting so involved in this when it is an
Right.
internal matter?
Right.
This
That's
is like
a great
almost,
question.
yeah, because to me, I look at the events around the world,
Mhm.
and I look at the issue of Taiwan as an example.
Yeah.
Well, the issue of Taiwan is an internal matter for
Right.
China.
Right.
So I know there are a lot of people will say, well, no, Taiwan is independent. It's like, yeah, but Taiwan is not a sovereign state. They
Right.
just state the fact as they are. So this is the same arguments for the case of Niger. They are now the revolution. And by the way, guys, Dr. Annika called it revolution.
Mhm.
There's now a sort of the terminology
Mhm.
is changing. They don't look at this as a coup. They look
Yeah.
at it as revolution.
Yeah.
And I can see the logic into that. And myself,
Mhm.
I used the term coup at the beginning,
Yeah.
and I refrained from using it anymore.
That's
Why?
interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I had to dig enough to find out if it is the
Why-
right term.
yeah. And because why did they do it, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, because if things were going so well, they wouldn't have done it.
But not only that, is also why the term will be more appropriate for that is because if you have the support of the population, something like that will consider revolution, a
Yeah.
revolution, not a coup. A coup is when you conduct it to overthrow the government,
Mhm.
but also against the will of the people.
Right. Well,
This is where the difference.
you know what, and that's in very important linguistics. So you
Yeah.
were talking about that earlier, the linguistics of why using certain words versus other words.
Mhm.
And you're absolutely right. Coup has the sense that the people were not involved in it.
Yeah.
But that does not seem to be the case. Objectively, that doesn't seem to be the case. And they're talking about how great things were under President Bazoum, but if that were true, that's literally what they're saying, is that things were not great, and that's why they took over the government, whether it was a revolution or a coup. That's why they did it. And people don't tend to revolt when things are going well.
Well,
Do you know what I
That
mean?
is true.
And you can tell that the colonial powers did not want this to happen because of how actively they're going against it and trying to put President Bazoum back in. So if it's going against the will of the people that hard, who did it?
Yeah.
Right. And it's, it's possible because they asked the Wagner group for help. It's very possible that Russia had some involvement or China had some involvement. I don't know that for a fact. I don't know that for a fact, but I do know that that's who they went to. They turned to Wagner. And then mysteriously, Prigozhin dies not very long after that.
But also because this saw the results in Mali, that it was with the assistance of the Wagner that they were able to kick the French out.
Well, and also in Ukraine, Wagner has made most of.
They are. As a matter of fact, they just signed now. The President Putin asked them, all of them, no exception, to sign the allegiance to Mother Russia.
Well,
about time.
I understand.
Well, it's
I understand why that happened. This whole thing has gone down kind of like a movie.
There's a lot of stuff to unpack on that for another day.
Yes,
because it's so. All right. Well, let's move on. So just to wrap this up before we move to the next topic, the idea of now the EU calling for all this, it's nothing but I almost feel comfortable using the term, we're gonna go against extremism and so forth. It's nothing but a diversion. Right. When in reality, NATO's presence is expanding slowly, starting from Mauritania, going on, because that region, the whole Sahel region, is the richest in the part of Africa. There are other countries that have other resources as well.
Absolutely.
But that's where the concentration.
This is a very interesting piece of exactly what you just said, David.
Yeah.
It's interesting looking through the research. Every so often you'd hear one tiny little line that said, well, and the EU also wants to counter Russian influence because of Wagner, right? So it's like, well, this is, it's these groups, but also the EU wants to counter the Russians because of Wagner.
To justify.
And it's like, that's like the tiniest little lie. It's like one little line about that. And it's like, you guys, you're not even hiding it very well.